What is Flatland? Flatland is a book by Edwin Abbott. Don't know why they did the double thing on his name, but there you go, Edwin Abbott. And it's later been made into a film. But this book from the 19th century was written by a teacher. And this is how it goes. This is the story. It's narrated by a square. And the square tells of his adventure where he goes into Lineland. And when this two-dimensional object goes into a one-dimensional space, nobody really gets who he is. They just see him as a sequence of dots, a line, because they have no understanding of what a two-dimensional object is, what a square is. And of course this is frustrating for a square to not be fully understood. But then it roles are reversed, because then the square is visited by a sphere, a three-dimensional object. And the square really, he just can't get his head around this three-dimensional thing, a sphere. He just sees a sequence of circles and ovals and things like that. That is, of course, until he visits Spaceland. So in Spaceland, the square gets this three-dimensional universe experience for the first time, and he realizes that things have depth. And this epiphany, this revelation of space, is something which the square tries to bring back to his own world, to Flatland. But nobody in Flatland wants to listen. In fact, they think it's quite a dangerous thing to start talking about this sort of thing. And they make his life very difficult. They basically persecute him for even suggesting that there is a dimension out there which has got depth. Now, in some ways, it's a silly story, but it's a very powerful, clean way of describing many different dimensions to life, to culture, to not just mathematics, of course. In fact, the book originally was a critique of social rigidity in Victorian England, how people couldn't move between social layers. But of course, the book is very smart. It functions on all kinds of levels. So, why do we start episode 3, this third introductory episode on this? Well, basically 2 reasons. Firstly, climate education in general in secondary schools is a bit flat. It doesn't have depth, and it doesn't have depth in 2 key respects. The first respect is that it doesn't engage in complexity. What happens with students as they get into their later teenage years in secondary school is they start advancing their all of their subjects, maths, physics, chemistry and so on, and get to a very high level, approaching university, undergraduate level. But it doesn't happen in environmental education, so it just gets a bit boring, gets a bit flat. And the second reason is a more, let's say, social reason. And that is that climate education doesn't invite students to engage with the full scope of the crisis. It tends to be cropped either into just the basic science of the climate crisis, or if there is any kind of activism or any kind of actions which go along with the understanding of global warming and the other features of it, it tends to be very superficial and very, well, one-dimensional. There's only really one story in town in schools, and that story is individual actions, individual carbon footprint-based actions. Sometimes amplified across a whole school, but still the DNA of those actions is still just about individual guilt or individual responsibility and do less or do more recycling. And it's very flat. So that's Flatland. So what's the problem with being flat? What's the problem with living just in Flatland and not exploring Spaceland? Well, the first thing to say is that it's dangerous. There are things in these higher dimensions which are real, and those realities will invade our space if we're not aware of them. And a good example of this and how human perception can be limited, a very funky example, was identified by the psychologist Villanov Ramachandran. And he identified a Swiss woman who had a condition called motion blindness. So most of us see the world as a flow. We see things happen in time and space with a flow to it. But she'd had an accident, damaged her brain, and this brain damage had led her to this condition of motion blindness. So she only saw the world in a series of images. And that made it difficult for her to cross the road because she had no notion of speed. It made it difficult for her to pour a glass of water for the same reason. So seeing the world in this kind of strobe-like way cropped out certain features of the world which were important, like measuring distance and speed. So if we just live in this flatland existence, and if our climate change education is just two-dimensional, it's actually quite dangerous, because we are producing a whole cohort of young people into the world who graduate from secondary school, and really, if you said the word climate change to them, many students just maybe think of polar bears or recycling projects or the fact that there are quite a few extreme weather events. But it doesn't go further than that. And that's far too limited. We can't afford to have a population going to vote, consume and be citizens who don't see the three dimensions of things, because those three-dimensional things are real. And the second reason for inviting us to go beyond Flatland into Spaceland is it is just much more interesting. It's much more interesting in three-dimensional space. So the Climate Academy is committed to taking students' awareness and actions into this deeper world. This alarm for the third time, we know what that means. It's time for a deeper cultural look at things. And I have to confess, this is a favourite of mine. Right now in school, I'm actually teaching this, and it is utilitarianism, and utilitarianism in conversation with Dostoevsky. So, first, utilitarianism. What is this? Well, this in some respects reflects this two-dimensional world. In utilitarianism, first conceived by Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher, around the turn of the 19th century, he proposed that ethical actions, if you're trying to think what is the right thing to do in any tricky moral situation, what you should do is consider the consequences, only the consequences, and those consequences should be assessed according to a basic maxim. And that maxim is the greatest good for the greatest number. So, what is the greatest good? Well, Bentham says that this is happiness. This is human happiness. He says that nature's placed us under the sovereignty of two things, pleasure and pain. So we should try and maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So whenever you're thinking about what to do in any tricky ethical situation, then you should democratically try to maximize the greatest amount of pleasure. And he introduces this hedonic calculus to help you do that. And the calculus, you should consider things like how many people are affected, the extent of it, how pure is the action, the fecundity of the action, how likely is this action going to produce more happiness in different ways, how fertile is it, like that. So there are 7 vectors inside this hedonic calculus. Now, this ethical theory, this kind of spreadsheet ethical theory, where you're weighing up and calculating these little blobs of happiness and blobs of sadness, it's kind of like a Pac-Man ethical theory, was very popular and extremely influential. I mean, it does appeal to our common sense. When you're out at a Saturday night with friends and you can't quite decide what to eat or what film to watch together, then you can just deploy this hedonic calculus and measure the relative happiness of everybody in the group and come up to a kind of nice democratic conclusion. So it does appeal to our common sense, but when you push the theory to its, if you test it in more extreme circumstances, then it gets a bit problematic, because what if somebody sat on the sofa on the Saturday night says, well, you know what, I don't really want to watch a film. I'd much prefer to be stabbing Jim in the eye with a screwdriver. I get a lot of pleasure out of that. And it turns out that the other people on the sofa, the other 5 people on the sofa, also enjoy that masochism. So poor old Jim, whose pleasure is minimal from this and whose pain is intense, unfortunately for him, this his displeasure is going to be outweighed by the other masochists in the room. And most people would say, well, look, this is really not acceptable. You know, this is really clearly not moral. But within the boundaries of utilitarianism, within the boundaries of the theory, this is legitimate, because there's no other standard to use other than pleasure and pain. There's no God, there's no rights, there's nothing else to measure the action by other than the consequences in terms of happiness and sadness. So when I teach this, I kind of call it ethical bleach. Utilitarianism is like this bleach. It reduces everything down to just pleasures and pains. So it's very practical, and this, like I said, a spreadsheet mentality, of course, it was conceived during the time of the Industrial Revolution, and it was conceived at a time in the 19th century when there's a great democratic impulse. Lots of people started to be, lots of men were starting to be accepted onto the democratic voting sheets. Women have to wait about another 100 years. So it is like a child of its time, and it was very popular. But now to the second component of this deep dive. Utilitarian ideas work their way across the channel, they work their way through the continent, and they reach Russia. And they reach Russia in different forms. There's a book by Chernyshevsky, What is to be Done, and so there's little kind of prototype samples of this type of thinking, this materialist, reductivist way of thinking about what's morally right and wrong. And what Dostoevsky does is he writes novels which are in conversation with this reductivism. And the most famous example of his response to that is the book Crime and Punishment. So the book Crime and Punishment is an absolute masterpiece. It works on so many levels. It's so psychologically deep. I'm not going to suggest here that it is just simply a response to Jeremy Bentham, but let's take it like that. So Dostoevsky conjures up a character called Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, who is a poor student, and he's living in St. Petersburg. His sister is just about to enter into a very difficult marriage, which really she shouldn't be doing because she's essentially just prostituting herself. And the mother is sick, and Raskolnikov himself is struggling to concentrate on his studies. He's a legal student, and yeah, it's just a hard life for poor old Raskolnikov. He's a very nice man. He's very handsome, a very kind of charming guy. But a dark thought enters his head because he is aware of this new modern way of thinking, and he thinks to himself, you know, upstairs there's a pawnbroker, and many people go upstairs to pawn watches and purses and things like that in order to pay the rent. And the woman who is the pawnbroker, she's really quite miserable. She's really quite a nasty character. She even bullies her half-sister. So Raskolnikov thinks, well, why don't I kill this lady and take the wealth, and then I could do great things. Of course, for my family, but bigger than that, in a kind of Napoleonic sense, I could do great things with my life. As a great student of law, I could, change the world for good. Brackets, I could increase the greater good for the greater number. And the act of killing her mustn't be spiritualized or anything. This is just material. This is just an action, like on the sofa with the screwdrivers. So he resolves to kill the pawnbroker. So he goes upstairs. He has an axe hidden in his cloak. He hands over his gift to be pawned. The lady takes it, turns her back, and Raskolnikov lands the axe on her skull and kills her. Now, all of this is described in extraordinary psychologically alert detail. The backstory to Dostoevsky is that he ended up in Siberia doing hard labor because he was a naughty boy. He'd been doing some political tracts against the Tsar at the time, who didn't really like the idea that you should criticize the government, and so he was about to be shot actually in the centre of St. Petersburg along with his rebellious friends, and at the last minute he's pardoned and he doesn't get executed, but Dostoevsky is taken along with his friends into darkest Siberia to chisel rocks for several years. Now, when he's there, it's likely that he would have had conversations with people who actually deserved to be there, who actually were psychologically deranged and maybe committed some terrible crimes. And this moment where Raskolnikov kills the old lady is informed, it seems, by a tremendous psychological insight into what it is like to kill somebody. Now, unfortunately for Raskolnikov, the moment that he does this, and he's just tidying up, the half-sister unexpectedly arrives, and so he has to kill her as well. So now there's two deaths, and things are starting to spin out of control, and within a few pages we find Raskolnikov with a whole load of money, but a massive guilty conscience, and he just doesn't know what to do. He can't even look at the money. He dumps it, he leaves it, and by the end of the book, Crime and Punishment, he hands himself over to the chief of police, and he's in prison. He's given himself up. And in prison, he interrogates himself. Like, he asks the deep questions. What is it to be human? What is it to have values? What are these things rooted in? And he comes to the conclusion that essentially there is a God, and these things have like a platonic, there's a platonic fiber to the universe. Morality is real, and and people are essentially spiritual. And what Dostoevsky is doing is really a devastating critique of the simplicity of utilitarianism. This idea that you can just reduce humans to pleasure animals, reduce them to just like Pac-Men in the universe, gobbling pockets of happiness and trying to avoid ghosts or trying to avoid pain. So this deep dive into both Bentham's utilitarianism and Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is simply to bring to the surface the richness of human culture and the richness of reflection on life at a deeper level in Spaceland, not just Flatland. And I encourage you to read Dostoevsky's books. They're extremely readable. And just to finish, the other aspect, I've cropped it down to just a conversation between utilitarianism and Dostoevsky like this, but if we just push that button on Dostoevsky a little bit further, what's at work in Dostoevsky's novels is an awareness of the irrationality of man. Now, humans are fundamentally irrational. We're just a little bit wacky. We do things which we even cause ourselves pain sometimes just to be awake to identity, just to be awake to meaning. And his books are viscerally awake to these kinds of issues. So that's a beautiful world. We live in a human culture with centuries of magisterial works of literature like that, which are worth reading, they're worth chewing on. And the Climate Academy is interested in all of those things. And the climate crisis forces us to think about that. When you're put under pressure, when you get down to the fundamentals, like Raskolnikov in prison, when you get down to the fundamentals, what is it to be human? Do we have depth? And the Climate Academy answers emphatically, affirmatively, yes, we do. And we love that depth. Actually, there is one extra comment I want to make in comparison between the Flatland of utilitarianism and the Spaceland of Descartes. And that's simply to point at GDP. So when Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment is thinking through these different possibilities, and he ends up murdering the old woman upstairs, in some ways he's just reducing everything down to the rubble of material happiness. Okay, there's a Napoleonic spirit in him, this kind of, I'm going to be a modern man. But in its simplest terms, he's just thinking in these practical economic consequences. And in the name of those practical economic consequences, he carries out the most atrocious act. And this is a little bit like GDP. Recently, Gutierrez, the Secretary of the UN, pointed out that GDP also includes the chopping down of pristine forests and the overfishing of our oceans. So this comparison between Bentham and Dostoevsky also brings to the surface how ridiculously simplistic our economic models are that are based purely on GDP, which measures economic growth in this very basic material way. And I had the chance to interview Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist. You can find that on my YouTube channel. And Stiglitz makes the same point about GDP and how inadequate it is. And in fact, and this is a topic for later chapters, we've always known that GDP was a useless measure of economic growth, or of growth, of human development. And yet we're still stuck with it, even after Kuznets said, Kuznets is the guy, the economist who gave us that measure in the late 1920s, after the Wall Street crash, as a kind of way of just measuring and getting a handle on the data in all the chaos that was around in the late 1920s, the economic chaos. And when he gave that measuring stick to the world, he also said, hey, I'm giving you this stick, but don't take it too serious. This is not a great stick to measure everything by. So this comparison between the Flatland of utilitarianism and the Spaceland of Dostoevsky is quite sharply related to our inadequate notion of growth and the poverty of the measure, which is we call GDP. So what's the point of the Climate Academy? Well, of course, the whole 16 chapters of this will unfold it all in its beautiful cultural details of what it is to be human and to live a kind of a full response to the climate crisis. But I just want to point at something significant. And that is that the Climate Academy is geared towards actions which have leverage. So we've just seen this difference between Flatland and Spaceland, between utilitarianism and Dostoevsky. And our thinking about what actions are valuable should also be informed by trying to reach depth. The typical school response to climate change and climate education is this one-dimensional individual action, individual carbon footprint stuff. But really we should be thinking not just in two-dimensional space, but three-dimensional space. We should be thinking about these leverage points for action. So whenever Climate Academy does projects, leverage points is an important feature of the planning and the management of those projects. And the three leverage points which the Climate Academy is particularly focused on is education, media, and the law. Now, education is relatively obvious. It's been designed for education, but the leverage part of that is that you just need one Climate Academy in a school, a small group of people, just 3.5%, and we'll come to that statistic later, but a small group of people can have a massive impact in how everybody understands it. A few people in a group, one group of, let's say, 10 or 12 students, can take the other students in the school on a voyage from Flatland to Spaceland. And once you've been to Spaceland, you can't unsee it. And in fact, you can see all the important features of Spaceland in quite a short period of time. It could just be one big event or one major set of publications. So education is a leverage point. And all the students then in the school who become informed about climate change can go home and then talk to their parents. So there are all kinds of nodes in the world through education, through events, through publications, where you can have a very big transformative impact with quite a small set of concepts and quite a small set of people. And with that, you get a big impact. So that's the first leverage point. The second leverage point is media. That in order to get traction beyond just an event, it's important to involve the media in how you leverage things. So local media, national media. You should be thinking from the school level media, from school websites and publications like that, through to local, national, and eventually international. So media is also a massive multiplier, a huge leverage point. If you just have a media that was systemically informed about the climate crisis, things would shift. People as consumers, as citizens, as voters, they would behave differently if we had this Spaceland, three-dimensional climate awareness. So the media has got a big role to play, and the climate academies can input and can influence media. And finally, law. This is, of course, massively complex, but law is a leverage point in a system. It's like the grammar to everything else which happens in a society. Laws can fix boundaries. Laws can install rules and regulations about how things work, can channel investments and so on. Laws are a massive game changer, far beyond what individual actions can do. So those are three leverage points which we advocate for in the Climate Academy. So to keep the geometrical theme going, sometimes in the book I refer to the Climate Academy as a triangle. Well, what does that mean? Well, basically there are 3 points or 3 aspects to the Climate Academy. This course, which is about to start in the next episode, is the Systems Understanding course, and you can also do it by reading this book. So Systems Understanding is the first principle of the Climate Academy. It's what gives it depth. It's what gives this unique, let's say, vantage point on the crisis. So that's the first pillar. And in fact, the second pillar is from Systems Understanding, we get civic engagement. So it's no use just knowing things inside your own head. I mean, it is a fundamentally important start, but civic engagement is what is transformative. So there are two aspects of civic engagement in the Climate Academy. Number one is publications. Number two is events. So let's do the first one, publications. You can take any aspect of this textbook, any chapter, any paragraph even, or any quote, like we've just done Dostoevsky and utilitarian. It can be anything from there. If you're more science-minded, it can be to do with the science of climate change. If you're more arty-minded, it can be to do with climate anxiety or psychology or social tipping points, things like that. You take any aspect of this book and you make a publication out of it. You make your own article or your own artwork or your own video. It's a huge list. And in 2026, we'll be starting to develop a part of the Moodle where you can plug into all different kinds of projects, Climate Academy projects, which head towards a publication. So there's all kinds of different things you can do. So that's the first aspect or the first possibility in civic engagement. The second option is events. Some people are fantastic public speakers. Some people enjoy managing and organizing an event. Some people are wonderful musicians or artists. These can be included in the event. So what the event does is like the publication. You take a key concept from here, like a tipping point, and you structure an event around it. You invite a VIP speaker in perhaps, or an academic or a public figure. You give them space to share their expertise on climate or the related issue which you're doing. And the students, yourself, you speak at that event. You'd also have a voice. And you carry into the public space this key systemic understanding. And there is finally then a third pillar. So the third component of the Climate Academy structure is systems entrepreneurship. And this happens when you go really deep. So if you achieve a gold level in any one of the previous two pillars, you can apply to the Climate Academy here in Brussels to achieve a systems entrepreneurship certificate. So what is that? Well, what you would notice when you try to bring systems understanding into the civic space is that you come up against all kinds of blocks, all kinds of inertia, all kinds of friction, because this is a complex problem. In fact, as we saw in the previous episode, it's a super wicked problem. And when you really try and do something, you're going to come up against many different types of blocks to achieving this understanding. So the systems entrepreneurship is about when you transcend those blocks, when you produce something which overcomes these real, let's say, DNA, like genetic difficulties with a complex problem. And typically, to be a systems entrepreneur, it's got two features. Either what you do has got legacy to it, so that many other generations of people or many different people will be able to copy and emulate what you've done. You create something which repeats itself. Or secondly, it has real leverage to it, as we explained in the previous points. So a Climate Academy student who really goes deep will come up against some serious difficulties and will show the resilience and the character to overcome them, and a kind of creativity which is transcendent. And one final word about all of that is that the Climate Academy is absolutely committed to intersectional things. So the climate crisis is not just a super wicked problem. It's a problem which has got all kinds of inbuilt injustices, intergenerational injustices, gender injustices, wealth injustices. There's a whole kaleidoscope of injustices which play through the climate academy, which play through the climate crisis. And the Climate Academy is committed to building a just and fairer future, a stable future, of course, but a just and a fairer one. And to be a systems entrepreneur means that you are handling these systems which are in play, these power systems or these systems of injustice. So those are the three different points of the Climate Academy. Systems understanding leads to civic engagement, and sometimes that leads to the third pillar, which is systems entrepreneurship. So the Green Comp framework was something written by the Joint Research Centre, which is part of the European Commission, back in 2022. And I was actually on the Eurostar train when I first read that document as a PDF, and I couldn't believe what I was reading, because this was exactly what I was doing in the Climate Academy for years. And now it was recognized, like in words, like somebody else had seen things in a similar way. So it was a fantastic affirmation of what the Climate Academy was doing. And so the Climate Academy has used the Green Comp framework to construct our certificates. More of that in a minute. A few more words about what is inside this Green Comp framework. Well, basically, the Green Comp framework has got 12 different skills or competencies, so Green Comp. So 12 different skills which are important for genuinely deep climate education. And some of those skills are particularly developed through the Climate Academy. One of the sets of skills comes under the heading of engaging in complexity. And we've talked about the importance of that before. Complexity is what we are as humans. It's what makes us alive. And we shouldn't crop students' understanding of climate into simplistic cliches. So engaging in complexity is both interesting and vital. It's this Spaceland aspect of it. And there are deeper details in that. So that involves systems thinking. It involves problem framing, not just problem solving. And another feature of the Green Comp framework, you can find the document online, I'm just picking out the highlights here, is political agency. So again, if we only reduce climate to simplistic scientific blobs or simplistic individual carbon footprint actions, then that's not going to get us far, and it's just not interesting for young people. So the Green Comp framework is a little bit like Spaceland. It takes typically two-dimensional thinking about climate education and challenges it to be more three-dimensional. So how do you progress through the Climate Academy? Well, all good education has scaffolded learning. All good education has different levels of challenge through which you can progress. And so the Climate Academy is no different. It starts with participation, then it moves on to expertise, then it moves on to autonomy, and finally leadership. So those are the 4 layers of achievement. And let's just run that through as an example with systems understanding. So the first pillar, participation, is following these videos. It's reading the Climate Academy textbook, and it's showing that you have absorbed and understood the systemic level material by answering a quiz. In a sense, it's as simple as that. Participation is the first step in your progress. Of course, it's a transformative step, and this system's understanding is not easy. It's challenging on various mental levels, but also emotional or like on a character level. So that's the first level. Then the expertise comes when you take that understanding and you indulge it. So in the systems understanding pillar, what you can do is you can take any chapter from this textbook, any episode from this series, and you can do your own talk out of it. That can be a talk to a class in school, or it can be a talk outside of school. It can be a talk in a community. It can be a talk to some parents. I had a Finnish student some years ago who gave an absolutely terrific talk on the carbon budgets to a Finnish mothers knitting group on a Tuesday. So you can address any audience who will listen. Of course, you have to organize it, which is another kind of skill. But at this second level, you're developing your understanding. So you're becoming an expert in a certain niche of these 16 chapters. Because by teaching something, that's when you learn it the most. Right. Next level, which is autonomy. At this level, what you're doing is you're really acting with leverage. So in the case of systems understanding, you're starting a climate academy. You're replicating that knowledge with many other people. So you're bringing a group to engage with all this material. Now, that climate academy might be completely fresh to your school. You could be doing this online, on your own, on your phone, just as an individual following the course, and there could be no climate academy in your school. Well, you can start one with just 2 or 3 friends. It could be that you've gone through this course because your school is already doing a climate academy. And if that's the case, you could start a new little climate academy with a group inside your school with younger students. An example of this for me was a few years ago, an Italian student who had graduated through the Climate Academy program with me. She'd gone off to university, she'd done environmental studies, and when she'd finished her university degree, she contacted me to say, hey, I want to give a bit back. What can I do with my year? She'd taken a gap year. So we cooked up this fantastic plan that she came back into the school and she did a climate academy for just the Italian students in the school because she was Italian. So that had a specific kind of focus. So at the gold level, you're becoming autonomous. You're taking your own independent initiative to start something. And that thing which you're starting has got leverage. And then finally is the level of leadership. And this is the systems entrepreneur badge. So when you do something like starting a climate academy like that, it's very likely that this will lead to something which is particularly powerful or has got particular strength, leverage, or legacy. And in the case of this Italian student, for example, what happened is that that group of Italians went on a little trip to Italy, and that group of younger students that was led by the former student started a climate academy in an Italian school near Milan. So that's an example of being a systems entrepreneur. So there you go. Those are the 4 levels of the Climate Academy progress. It's participation, followed by expertise, followed by autonomy, followed by leadership. So as you know, this is free. You can see here it's an open source document. You can go to the Climate Academy website and download it and then print it off. So this is open knowledge. I'm sharing my brain, I'm sharing my heart, I'm sharing my soul into this document, and it's for free because the Climate Academy is absolutely committed to the public understanding of science. Because so much knowledge out there, so much data is often weaponized or commercialized. So the Climate Academy is done in my spare time, it's in my free time, it's always been like that. And it's done because these things just matter. We're just committed to this notion of public wealth. Now, public wealth is a beautiful thing. And I also believe in founding the Climate Academy and in setting all this up in the transformative power of education. And education literally means to lead out. And a school literally means a free space. If you go into etymology of those words, you have education leading out. And this is what systemic understanding is all about, is about getting people, leading people out from Flatland into Spaceland. And it being a free space, a school is a free space, and that's a vital thing in a world where there's so much commercial pressure on everything, where public spaces are shrinking. It's so important to have these things just freely available. In fact, I can indulge a detail from one of the books that I wrote several years ago, and it was called Nietzsche Tackles Climate Change. I've done a series of books about climate change and philosophers. And in the book, in the section on Nietzsche, I use a map of an airport in Norway. And if you look at this now, I'll put it on the screen. If you look at it, there are basically 3 stages of the development in this airport. And what you can notice is that with each redevelopment of the airport over the years, the public space shrank and the commercial space enlarged. So at the beginning, you could just walk into the airport and you didn't have to walk through duty free. Whereas today, when you walk into an airport, you have like miles of duty free corridors and shelves to navigate through before you can get to like just a seat to sit down. So the whole notion of travel, just to go anywhere, is just become a commercial experience. Now, it's a simple example, but this is typical. It's a silly example in a way, but it isn't, because this is exactly what has happened to society. We've got smaller and smaller public spaces, smaller and smaller areas where we can get together and think and collaborate and develop public wealth. So the Climate Academy is founded on these commitments to humans, commitments to public wealth. I stopped the video, but there's actually one more thing to say, and that is that there is, in order to get a certificate, if you want to actually get the certificate, an official certificate, there's a small administration cost for that, because I do have expenses doing all of this. Accountants, websites, all of that. So there is a small admin charge for a certificate if you want to get the official one. And what we've done with those certificates is that they are charged at different rates according to where you live. So if you're from the global north, you're going to subsidize the global south. That's as simple as that. But we've actually used the CUTX index and these different categories of development. So there are actually 4 different ranges of prices. But anyway, the point is that small admin charge for the certificate enables us to do this.